afternoon, everybody. I'm Christian Hede. I'm president of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation here in Washington, D.C. And I welcome all of you to today's event, which is I would say, truly Humboldtian venture. Professor Michael Kimmage and Sam Denney are alumni of the Federal Chancellor Program of the Humboldt Foundation. And together with Kateryna Bondar, they approached us with the idea to put this webinar together. And we thank them very much for their initiative, because this is exactly what American Friends of Humboldt is aiming to do, working together with engaged Humboldtians and the Transatlantic community on the issues and concerns that are relevant on both sides of the pond and worldwide. And what issue could be more relevant and consequential for transatlantic relations than the war of aggression against Ukraine in the heart of Europe? In 11 days from now, it will be exactly 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. That's over 700 days of Russian aggression and violence against the people of Ukraine, over 700 days of continuous breaking of international law and of crimes against humanity. And there is seemingly no end in sight. Almost a year ago, in March 2023, we organized an event hosted by Indiana University with the Ukrainian and German ambassadors to the US and with the US ambassador at large for global criminal justice. One essential question back then was, how can we strengthen the transatlantic alliance for Ukraine in resistance to the Russian aggressor? This question, of course, is even more relevant today. The GOP frontrunner primaries of the US presidential election says that he doesn't care if President Putin attacks NATO allies if they don't pay what he considers some kind of a membership fee for NATO. All justified arguments about sufficient defense spending aside, I'm wondering if it can get any more transactional and cynical than that. At the same time, an alleged American journalist who has millions of followers conducts an interview with Putin, giving him a platform for his revisionist narrative. And to top all this, legislation to provide desperately needed aid to Ukraine has been stalled by a very polarized US Congress for months. On that front, we just heard good news maybe from the US Senate today. Let's see what the House will do or not do with that bill. The title of our program today is, Ilonka has said it, Ukraine, Russia, and a New Era in Transatlantic Relations. Obviously, there are distinctly different visions for that new era of transatlantic relations here in the United States, as the rhetoric of the presidential campaigns show. One would hope that on the European side of the Atlantic, and especially in Germany, simulations would be in full swing to prepare for all possible outcomes in November. But is that really the case? In addition to the battle to defend Ukraine's freedom and sovereignty, the transatlantic partners seem to battle amongst and with themselves, actually, about what course shall be taken. Is this proof for a dysfunctional system of democracy, as the dictator in the Kremlin would label it? Or is it rather a very robust version of a democratic process which will prevail in the end? And what does all this mean for the people of Ukraine who suffer each and every day? I'm sure that our great panelists of today will shed light on such pressing questions. Thank you again so much for your initiative, Michael, Sam, and Kate. Michael, I hand over to you now and look forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you so much, Ilonka, for doing everything to make this event possible. And it's a privilege and a pleasure for all of us to be with our virtual audience today, the globe-spanning world of the Humboldtians, to discuss an issue of great global consequence. And so I'll just briefly introduce myself and our two other panelists, and then we will delve right in. And I'll say from the outset, even before we begin our conversation, that anybody who has a question should send it into the chat function, because, roughly 20, 25 minutes into this event, we'll have a free-form conversation and go back and forth with our audience. So if you have a question in mind already, please send it in. Otherwise, just jump in when it does come to mind. So I'm Michael Kimmage. I was a German Chancellor Scholar in 2004, 2005 in Munich, and I'm currently a professor of history at the Catholic University of America and a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Going alphabetically, Kate Bondar is an associate fellow in the program on prosperity and development at CSIS, and also, of course, in a way that's very relevant to our conversation, former advisor to the president of Ukraine and to the Minister of Defense. And Samuel Denney is a senior research analyst at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and was also a German Chancellor Scholar, but in his case, a lot later than I was, 2021 to 2022. So sticking with alphabetical order, I'd like to pass the baton to Kate for a couple of opening remarks, and then we'll turn to Sam and have just a bit of back and forth among the three of us, and then to our audience. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you for having me here. It's a really interesting and inspiring conversation because honestly, I'm working on this particular issue right now. So like how we can strengthen the transatlantic cooperation and what can be done for Ukraine and what Ukraine can actually do for security architecture in Europe and transatlantic architecture more globally. So, and as Michael said, I've been directly involved into reforms implementation and advising to the President, Minister of Defense. So I'm actually a practitioner in this sphere. And in Ukraine, like from our perspective, I can feel a huge difference in between pretty simple little things, which are words versus actions. And I think this is where this narrative and discussion should go into and should switch, because we in Ukraine feel the huge difference when it, just on political level, just, talking, speaking, we have memorandums, we have agreements, we had Budapest memorandum, which was a promise. And we saw how it didn't work out in 2014 when we actually already had a full-scale war. We had invasion from Russia, we had occupation of Crimea. And unfortunately, what we mostly felt, these were just words, concerns, and a lot of political discussion. And 2022, when there was full-scale invasion, we actually felt the real support, the real action from Western allies, which is weapons supply, training, funding, technology share. A lot of Western companies came and shared their solutions to help to help Ukraine to sustain. So this is the difference. And 2 years later, we're still fighting, and we're fighting successfully. And this is the result of these actions taken by the Western allies. So coming back to the question of NATO involvement and transatlantic cooperation, I think we should switch this conversation into very practical, tangible initiatives and projects that should be implemented to strengthen the NATO and alliance inside and to help Ukraine to sustain this war and hopefully to win the war. So that's my vision and call to action that I wanted to deliver. And I'm happy to share more ideas like what specifically can be done now, especially in the wake of NATO summit coming in Washington, DC, because we all know that most probably there won't be any formal membership to Ukraine, but what can be done in meantime so Western allies in Ukraine can compete and hold this global competition with Russia and more broadly China.
Thank you so much, Kate, and let's turn directly to Sam for his opening comments.
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Kate. Really glad to be here speaking with both of you, and thank you to Christian and Ilanka for helping organize this. But so I just thinking about where we are as we approach the second anniversary of this conflict. I think we've looking from an American and kind of European standpoint, we've arrived at a moment where we perhaps need to reevaluate the strategic context in which we we think about this conflict, which has become and has been, as my Carnegie colleague Michael Kaufman has said, a long war. We need to reevaluate how we think about that for that reality. So there are kind of three takeaways I wanted to touch on briefly, and then we can get into them further in the wider discussion that I think about as we approach the second anniversary. And the first is that we've seen this amazing reversal in kind of how support for Ukraine has shaken out. And so this to me is looking at how the European Union is now the largest supporter of Ukraine, kind of having surpassed the United States as of at least October 2023, as measured by the Kiel Institute that we've all been following for the past 2 years. And just thinking back, what's more kind of amazing about this is that Germany specifically is the second largest national supporter of Ukraine, both in terms of overall support, but also specifically in terms of weapons. And so thinking back to my time in Germany, I remember the 5,000 helmets that was on offer kind of before the start of the war. You know, that is something that we cannot discount as a development in this conflict for how the United States and Europe have supported the Ukrainian war effort. But at the same time, this support is broken down along kind of what are perhaps traditional kind of transatlantic lines, right? With the United States providing the majority of the weapons and the Europeans providing now the majority of the financial support. And this is a huge problem. As we were discussing kind of at the beginning, Christian mentioned in his opening remarks that while the Senate has passed this $90 or so billion aid package, including $60 or so billion of support for Ukraine, it's unclear what the future of US military support for Ukraine is. And what I've really been looking for is what kind of our European partners and allies are thinking in terms of a plan B for how Europe can kind of plug the gaps should US support for Ukraine truly waver. You know, in the short term with this particular aid package, in the medium term, looking to the November elections here in the United States, and Trump's comments about a protection racket for NATO, and then looking at the longer term as the United States kind of reevaluates its grand strategy. And so I think we can talk a lot about how the Europeans can and should do more together. And the second point, and this is kind of really cribbing from work that Michael has done, is that the Russians have worked to globalize this conflict and have exploited supplies of grain, going to various parts of the world, have kind of developed security partnerships in Africa, and have increasingly turned to an ideology and propaganda to kind of divide the so-called global South, which we've also included in the remit for our conversation, from kind of the United States, Europe, and the rest of the G7. And so I think that's something that we really need to think more about as kind of a transatlantic relationship, is how do we approach this problem? And I think the good news there, and we were talking about in the kind of the pre-discussion chat we had, is what can we be optimistic about? And actually, thinking that the Russians have shifted to kind of this propaganda about, a multipolar world and kind of the hypocrisy of the United States and Europe. They're shifting to this propaganda is something we can be optimistic about, because they don't have really anything else to offer many of these countries. And so, I've been working here at Carnegie on a project looking at emerging powers and a lot of countries in the so-called global South that we haven't really known how to deal with before. And we need to really think more about what the United States and Europe's offer is to these countries and how we can better approach them. And I think before we get into the more detailed kind of conversation, something we can do is just better make the case for ourselves diplomatically. And so this is kind of surging diplomacy to these countries to make the case for what we're already doing before deciding, what we can do more. And so the final point I really wanted to bring up here before we get into the rest of the conversation is that, the global environment now facing kind of liberal democracies in the United States and Europe is one that looks increasingly dangerous. And so, on the back of a decade of crises, thinking about the 2008 financial crisis, the 2010-2011 Euro crisis, the Russian invasion of Crimea, the election of Donald Trump, you have the COVID pandemic, you have kind of ongoing transformations in the economies of our countries. You have Vladimir Putin's threats of nuclear destruction, right? And this is really a lot for people in both the United States and Europe to be afraid of. And so when people are afraid of these things, they often turn to politicians that might offer the simplest or most kind of easy to digest policy responses to kind of return things to what they conceive of as normal. And this is really an opportunity here for Vladimir Putin, as we've seen, because he knows very well how to exploit the grievances and divisions in kind of democratic societies. And so I think, just over the weekend, the French discovered a huge Russian propaganda outlet looking towards the European Parliament elections, this Portal Combat Initiative, as they called it. Last spring, you had reporting in the Washington Post that the Russians were seeking to kind of create an anti-Ukraine front out of this mixture of left and right protests in Germany that sprung up around COVID and inflation and kind of the war. And so this is really something that, if we're thinking about a long-term strategy for both Ukraine and to deter Russia, we need to consider how we can improve governance at home in order to prevent the Russians from having this sort of easy policy lever to undermine our deterrence strategies. So I'll leave things there. I think it's a lot to really get into. So we've kind of exploded the Overton window of this discussion, but I think I'm really excited to dive into all these topics with each of you, Michael and Kate. So over to y'all.
Terrific. So I have a question for each of you, for Kate and for Sam, and we'll once again urge our audience to write in with questions of their own. If none come in, I have no doubt that Kate and Sam and I can keep on going for as long as necessary. So Kate, I wanted to ask, of course, we know that Chancellor Scholz just made a visit to Washington last week where he was addressing members of Congress and had a meeting with President Biden. I think as a generalization, you could say that what Ukraine wants from the United States is similar to what Germany wants from the United States, which is to say sustained commitment to the transatlantic relationship, sustained funding for the military and for other sides of the Ukrainian war effort, and a kind of shared vision of Ukraine in Europe and in the West for the future. There might be, small or modest discrepancies between the Ukrainian and the German vision, but I think that they are basically similar. And both countries, Germany and Ukraine, have run up against the problem, I think, that you very eloquently outlined, which is that the US, it's been true for European countries in the past, but let's focus on the US here, the rhetoric has been ahead of the reality. And we've noticed that most conspicuously with Biden, who has shifted from as long as it takes to sort of as long as we can in terms of even the White House's approach to the war. And the rhetoric of Capitol Hill is all over the place, but the US is not following through on some of its verbal commitments to Ukraine. And I think very rightly, you sort of point out that this is a problem that goes back to 2014 and really the beginning of this war and all the way back to the 1990s and to the Budapest Memorandum, which for those who in our audience who may not be familiar with it was a promise given to Ukraine about its sovereignty and territorial integrity when Ukraine shipped its nuclear weapons to post-Soviet Russia. So there was that verbal commitment again, and it wasn't followed through. So I wanted to ask you, Kate, to speculate as to why there is this problem. Why does it happen that the US gets out ahead of something rhetorically and then doesn't quite follow through, or isn't at the moment following through? Because I think if we want to solve this problem of how to keep the US on board, we really need to know what the problem is. So I wanted to ask, in your assessment, Ukrainian colleagues and others, sort of why is it that the US ends up this way? And maybe we can think of a few thoughts collectively about how to address this or how to sort of ameliorate this problem, but I couldn't agree more about how serious this problem is. So Kate, over to you in terms of the American enigma.
Thank you, Michael, for this question. And I think it's this question actually relates not only for US, it's in any country we can face this issue, and we're actually facing these issues, and it's an election year, so we depend on internal processes inside the countries and fluctuations which are happening. So, and unfortunately, US is not an exclusion. That's why currently we're working on, two parallel streams, I would say, and I'm deeply involved into shifting the US administration strategy towards some long-term solutions, which would rely not only on agreements similar to Budapest Memorandum, that's a bad example, but yeah. And what I was talking about precisely is, for example, committing into development of military industrial complex of Ukraine. This is what would enable Ukraine to deter itself and to protect NATO and Europe from Russian expansion and moving toward the Western borders. So this is what US can practically do. Unfortunately, again, due to internal situation and political process inside, I don't want to dig into all those details. We know that the supplemental was tied to border deal, and now it's changing again. So I don't want to follow that, but I would rather focus on some things and solutions that US administration can still implement in parallel with that process. For example, for developing Ukrainian capability to defend itself and to defend Western countries. So, and it doesn't take, I mean, of course it takes money and funding, but still, like, one of the biggest obstacles for defense companies to collaborate with Ukrainian defense companies is export controls. I mean, it's our limitations. So what the US can do right now is to simplify a bit of procedure or develop a tailored and customized procedure specifically for collaboration with Ukrainian companies. Another thing is a contracting process. Like, if we give the initiative to private sector, to defense companies themselves, they have enough funding, they have enough investment capital to develop this collaboration, this cooperation. So what the administration can do right now is just to kind of open this window of opportunity and open this door for them to start implementing real projects. And this would contribute to broader discussion on US commitment and help into Ukraine and NATO involvement. Again, what I was offering to the administration is to consider an opportunity to use existing NATO tools and mechanisms, which are already there, for funding the same thing, but maybe on NATO territory. So NATO has this Innovation Development Fund or Diana Accelerator for defense startups, which are open, unfortunately, only for NATO members. So what NATO could do is to give an opportunity for Ukrainian defense companies to participate in those programs and benefit from funding, which is available through these programs. And US can actually take an advantage of its current, let's say, leading position by accepting this NATO summit and offering these solutions. So what I want to say is just we have a political process going on, and it's pretty hard to influence this, big variety and diversity of political, things and flows and ideas which is happening inside big bureaucracy in the United States to align all the positions and to come with one single strategy. It's pretty hard to do, trust me, as a practitioner again, but we can target small little initiatives which would form, the environment where US can actually contribute and help Ukraine to sustain and survive despite everything that's happening on the broader picture. So I'm still more into, practical and tangible things which are measurable and which can actually tie Ukraine to Western security architecture by economic means and economic interdependencies and connections, which which are actually way stronger than just political commitments, which can be easily disrupted. So yeah, that's my vision. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just two brief comments in response. I mean, I think the way not to do this is what Donald Tusk just attempted. And in a tweet, he said, "Shame on you Republicans for not supporting Ukraine." I don't think that that's going to go anywhere. And Lindsey Graham, who's now not going to go to the Munich Security Conference, is going to go to the US-Mexican border, lashed out at Tusk, saying he doesn't care at all what he has to say. And, I think shaming Republicans into supporting Ukraine, not that this is what the Ukrainian government is trying, is just a losing recipe. In another sense, and this I think really is just a different version of the comments you were making a moment ago, Kate, I think for President Zelensky, moral exhortation has exhausted itself. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just because it's a long war and now there's a war in the Middle East and people's attention sort of goes elsewhere, but I don't think the kind of very effective appeals he made to people's conscience at the beginning of the war, and then of course horrific events in Bucha and Irpin and elsewhere, confirm this. I think for the first year of the war, a lot of American support was that, a sense of moral outrage and a deep sense of connection to Ukrainian civilians. That's still there. It's not that that's gone away, but that somehow is not working as a political argument. So I think that you're entirely right. These sort of practical claims based on Ukrainian self-help, which I think is a language that Republicans tend to speak here at home and could be effectively used to encourage Republicans to support Ukraine. I think that that would be very useful. The other thing I would add, just as a student of American history, is that the more Ukrainians and Europeans can argue that European security is a very key aspect of US security, in simple, practical terms that people outside of Washington, D.C. can easily understand and sort of figure out, the better off I think we'll all be. The United States ended up fighting in 2 world wars because of internal European security problems. We certainly don't want that to happen again. A sort of third time. That's a natural reason for Americans to be concerned about Europe and to be concerned about Ukrainian security. So I think these are all, in a sense, self-interest arguments, which you were already suggesting, and I think that that's really the route to go. And there's a lot of space to be covered. I somehow wish that the Biden administration was doing a little bit more of this on its own, but this is a country where there's a lot of space for advocacy and initiative outside of formal and institutional channels, and I think that the Ukrainian embassy and other aspects of the Ukrainian government have been, and the diaspora have been creative about using them. But there's definitely more that could sort of be done in that regard. So thank you again, Kate, for following up on the practical nature of this enterprise and how U.S. commitment to Ukraine can be grounded in a varied set of practical commitments. Sam, I wanted to go over to you now and ask about your second point about the global aspect of the war, and maybe exaggerate just a little bit for effect, or exaggerate for the sake of sort of eliciting a strong answer from you. But I think that this has been the biggest disappointment of the war so far for I won't here try to speak for Ukraine, but for the United States and for let's say Western Europe or Europe writ large, that arguments that just seemed ironclad at the beginning of the war about the sovereignty of countries, about the war crimes against humanity that Christian mentioned in his introduction to the conversation, these have registered globally, to be sure, but there have been a lot of caveats and qualifications. And so the UN has been largely useless, in part because Russia sits on the Security Council and for those kinds of reasons, but there just hasn't been a groundswell of support there. A lot of abstentions, a lot of countries that have sort of been on the fence. We have China, which is providing a huge outlet to the Russian economy. We have North Korea and Iran, which are funding and sort of fueling the Russian war effort directly. We have lots of countries that just refuse to go along with these kinds of arguments, most prominently South Africa, Brazil, and India. We also have countries kind of knocking on the door to enter the BRICS coalition, which shouldn't be happening according to the way that we understand the war. So I won't go on with any more of these examples, but I want to ask you about why this hasn't, for us, gone better than we expected to, and what might be some of the features. Obviously, if the U.S. did more, you suggested surging diplomacy, that I think would be to the good. But even then, I think there are going to be some big challenges and problems. I just wanted to ask you to address those. What's the nature of the problem there as well?
Yeah, no, I think, and just to start off, I think it's revealed a lot about sort of the transatlantic blinders that we have in the United States and Europe in this kind of community, and that we believed the world worked according to a set of norms and values that were universal, and we've come to find out that I think the global environment outside of this kind of transatlantic relationship is a lot more interest-driven and value and transactional than we wanted to believe the world really is. And I think but it's also, revealing, especially, to the United States, kind of the failures of its past policies regarding these countries. And I think specifically about kind of the lack of US policy towards Latin America, for example, and how, this is something I remember hearing quite a lot from Brazilian colleagues when I was in Germany on the fellowship, but how, the spillover, for example, from US politics into Latin American and Brazilian politics is something that we don't think about hardly at all. And so I think it's revealing of the deficits that we have had as a transatlantic community and how we approach the rest of the world. So that's for one. And I think for two, I mean, thinking about, the surging diplomacy question, right, that's not sufficient, because obviously going knocking on the doors of countries like Brazil or South Africa or India, and saying, making the point about norms and values and how, it can't be allowed to stand that Russia has invaded the country. We're going to get something along the lines of, what about Iraq, right? Which is it's a fair kind of argument, but doesn't justify what Russia has done. But I think we need to think about instead, what is really on offer for kind of these countries in the so-called global South, whose very name kind of indicates the lack of understanding that we have for the problem, because these countries are very different from each other. But in kind of working on this project I've been doing for the last year or so, there are a number of similarities in what these countries are seeking. And it's one, kind of support with their economic development strategies, right? Or a more equitable distribution of power in global institutions. And so, the thing, when you notice countries trying to join BRICS, or the Brazilians saying that nothing will stop them from deepening relations with China, or championing BRICS right after the Russians blew a warlord out of the sky. To me, that says this points again to the kind of lack of an offer, a competing offer from the United States and Europe, which have a GDP that is far greater than Russia. I was at an event last week, and I think the collective GDP of the Rammstein coalition is something like 30 times that of the Russian GDP. And so we should have the capacity to make this sort of offer. And so, what does that mean? It's looking at what the specific kind of complaints are and ways that we can kind of think about that, providing more support for development, providing greater trade liberalization, which I know is a dirty word in Washington these days, but looking at ways to where we can bind these countries more into a better system for global politics. And I think, I want to close just by, again, thinking about this problem that we faced with countries like Brazil or India, other parts of this kind of rest of the world. And this was raised by a German lawmaker last week, actually, in that I'm not sure how you can expect, for example, a Brazilian farmer to support the Europeans' war effort if they can't even trade with Europe, right? There's no part of their prosperity that is tied in with this European effort for them. And they also noticed the dichotomy between, how conflicts in Europe are handled versus conflicts in the rest of the world. And so I think it's really a challenge for us as a transatlantic community to not only kind of double down on diplomacy, but also really think about, what our value add or our value proposition is for an international system that is predicated upon, countries not invading each other. So that's what I would kind of respond to that.
Yeah,
Of course, yeah.
May I also add a couple of things to what Sam said, and I totally agree. Just last week or a couple of weeks ago, we had at CSS a big roundtable with ambassadors of African countries and Latin American countries. And I was talking to them and so why Chinese policy and why your cooperation with China is way more efficient than with the United States, like very straight and direct question. And they say, and they answer pretty directly as well, because China offers very concrete things. They offer very cheap investment. They offer very low bureaucracy. So here's the money. This is how you can get the money. This is how you structure the project. It's very fast, it's very efficient, and it's very accessible. This is what they need. China invests a lot of money into infrastructure development. Look at their Belt Road Initiative. It unites 150 countries across the world. It's a long-term, huge project, which actually unites the world. And China is paying for it. It's pretty simple. So what the US has to counter offer, what are the big projects? What are the big initiatives? What are the big investment? So the feedback that I heard from them is that it's very hard to trade with the United States. It's very hard to to kind of accept more ideological side that, what would the United States offer? Protection of human rights, protection climate change mitigation and adaptation, and all sorts of pretty good, but abstract things. They need very, again, tangible things. This is what I feel the difference in approaches, and this is what pushes the global South more to Chinese side than the American side as of now. So that's the very good, sphere to think about.
So again, urging anyone who wishes to, to weigh in with questions to send into the Q&A function, and we will sort of read them out and pass them along to our panelists. But in the interim, I have a sort of question or a multi-part question for our two panelists of my own, and it stems from this notion which you, Sam, borrowed from your colleague Michael Kaufman about this being a long war, which seems to me like one of the few safe predictions that we can make about this war at the present moment. And I think that there's an optical illusion in the midst of this long war, which is that for very to reference Kate, for practical reasons, journalism in Russia is now almost impossible to practice. So we have a little bit of independent journalism there. We have Telegram, we have social media, we have inferences that we can make, but for non-Russian journalists, it's a very difficult place to operate, and for Russian journalists, it's almost impossible to be independent. So Russia has become, as Putin would want it to be, has become very, very difficult to read. At the same time, we do know that an anti-war candidate sort of emerged for a few weeks in Russia, Boris Nadezhdin, and then was removed by the Kremlin as a possible sort of alternative candidate. So Putin is running predictably a rather curious election in which there seems to be, and perhaps will be, only one candidate coming forward in March. But I'm interested in that world sort of under the surface, and my guess is that there may be more happening there, not true anti-war sentiment perhaps, but more fragmentation, anxiety, doubt than we're able to see directly. We can just sort of keep that to the side. I'm happy to return to that point in a moment, but I wanted to ask you, maybe I'll ask Sam first about Germany and then Kate about Ukraine. We've spoken about the US and its political turmoil and travails. I sometimes worry that the narrative has become much too pessimistic about the US. The real story of the US over the last 2.5 years is of its massive commitment to Ukrainian security. And if we forget that that's a story that's in the foreground, we're going to misunderstand what the war is. Lots of difficulties, elections, challenges, to be sure, but it's not as if the US is absenting itself from the war or has done so in any sense in the last 2.5 years. But again, putting the US to the side, what's the German story at the moment, Sam? We have, a social democrat in power. This was a party that in the past had certain sort of sympathy for extended dialogue with Russia, skeptical about too much confrontation. We have the Zeitenwende and recently very strong commitments financially to Ukraine. Germany is, somebody should tell candidate Trump, Germany is spending now 2% of its GDP on defense, and yet I'm sure there's a great deal more that Germany could be doing. And I think we're all watching closely the popularity of the AfD and dwindling popularity of the Greens and of the SPD, and trying to figure out what that bodes. But I'd be curious to get your assessment of where Germany is at the present moment. Sam, speaking a bit more about domestic politics, maybe, and then Kate, I'll turn to you and ask about Ukrainian politics, because I think it's safe to say at the moment that politics has sort of returned to Ukraine, that we have a degree of sort of infighting at the highest levels of Ukrainian government, and not any indication that Ukraine is going to change gears or wishes to change gears, but the kind of, sort of, I don't know, apolitical is maybe not the right way to describe it, but this long moment at the beginning of the war where politics just wasn't crucial, that's now over. And so I'd be curious to get your assessment of the domestic political situation in Ukraine, Kate. So first to you, Sam, about domestic politics in Germany.
I think maybe to kind of provide a one-sentence answer to this. I mean, Germany, I am very, very worried about sort of the future of Germany, this kind of wither Germany question that people have been asking. I mean, for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned, the rise of the AfD, the kind of rise of the Bundesrat Wagenknecht party, these are all kind of groupings that offer a populist alternative to the kind of mainstream democratic consensus along different lines. And so the reason I'm kind of worried about this is it seems like in Germany you're facing sort of this kind of grumbling kind of rolling along crisis within kind of German society, where we have different segments that are activated along at different times based on being asked to make a variety of sacrifices. And so the most recent one of this is this kind of farmers tractor protest that occurred in Germany. I'm blanking on the exact beginning, but over the past kind of several weeks. And so this was triggered out of the kind of the previous crisis, which is the budget crisis that occurred, where, you know, the solution to closing a several, you know, tens of millions of euros gap in the German budget was to kind of make cuts in terms of fuel subsidies and other kind of subsidies for farmers, which triggered then this nationwide, you know, protest in Germany, with kind of tractors being parked in front of the Brandenburger Tor and all these things. And so what to me that symbolizes, and what most of the analysis of this I've seen, is that, you know, there is, and on the one hand in Germany, an awareness of, you know, the massive challenges the country faces in terms of, you know, the green transition, in terms of investing in infrastructure, I mean, just basic train lines and the like, in terms of the need to adapt to a new geopolitical environment, in which, you know, security is perhaps no longer guaranteed by the United States, in which there's a threat from Russia. And at the same time, kind of this collides with perhaps the less than perfect communication style of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, right? And so I think, you know, one, again, thinking back to this conversation last week with a German lawmaker, you know, one point that came out of that was that perhaps, you know, Germans are not yet ready for you know, looking at three-party coalitions and the kind of the divisions and the kind of style of governance that that creates, right? And so we've seen with the traffic light coalition of the SPD, the Liberals, and the Greens, that's been a lot of, you know, infighting and kind of back and forth between especially the Liberals and the Greens, with kind of Scholz in the background, often coming in too late to settle these divisions. And so this has created this kind of very chaotic kind of governance style over the past, I mean, perhaps for almost the entirety of you know, the coalition. I think back to when, you know, the first SPD defense minister was kind of laughed out of office because of her New Year's Eve video she recorded in the middle of Berlin amidst kind of fireworks and everything going off. And so I think, you know, thinking about whether Germany, it's really, you know, what I kind of view happening is there being the need for, in addition to this kind of geopolitical and security Zeitenwende, right, there needs to be kind of a political Zeitenwende in which kind of politicians realize that sort of the old ways of thinking about different issues, you know, I'm thinking specifically about the debt break and things like that, but the old way of thinking about, you know, political issues and the kind of the political kind of Overton window needs to change for a new environment in which different types of compromises are needed, and in which, you know, the German people seem to be very clearly looking for the leadership and kind of a steady hand to guide Germany through what are a very daunting series of issues. So in a nutshell, I know there's a lot on the table of that answer, but that's kind of how I look at Germany over the next you know, year to 2 years as we look to the next election.
I think that's a great overview of the situation there. I would only add one small footnote that with all the disagreement and the back and forth of a complicated coalition, the disagreement, to my eyes, doesn't really seem to be about Ukraine or about policy toward Russia. There, of course, AfD is a dissenting voice, but there seems to be really bedrock consensus in Germany, which I think is the foundation for the financial and military support that Germany is giving to Ukraine. So a structure, not quite like the US structure, is a little bit more firm.
Yeah, can I come back in very quickly on this point? Because I think that's actually really, you know, there is a lot of consensus in German politics about a number of issues. I mean, you think about Ukraine, but you also think back to, you know, COVID policy, which is what I was kind of studying when I was in Germany. But the majority of Germans have supported either sending weapons of one kind or another to Ukraine. I mean, there's always in Germany this debate over heavy weapons versus defensive weapons or whatever. Right. But, you know, once the government makes the decision, people support it. And so what the great success of groups like the AfD or, you know, the BSW is to create the impression that Germany is much more divided than it is. And so I think if you're looking for reasons for optimism, it's then in the wake of these revelations about an AfD conference, you know, about re-immigration of people who have immigrated to Germany, right? That, you know, thousands, I think over 1 million Germans went out in the streets in protest of the AfD. And so that's something to be, you know, there's a consensus in Germany, a majority that can be brought out onto the streets and politicized and driven to action. So that's something, to be optimistic about.
Yeah, and you could even make the point about the U.S. if you would note the number of Republican senators who just defied the will of their party frontrunner to push for supplemental support for Ukraine. It's a very substantial majority in the Senate, and that may be quite significant to what happens in the House, which would be the story not of division, which is the kind of most typical journalistic story at the moment. It would be a story of unifying behind a set of discrete policy objectives. Kate, can we turn to you and just have you reflect a little bit, on the current political situation, either in Kiev or more broadly in Ukraine, and then we have a wonderful question from an audience member to which we'll turn in just a moment.
Yeah, sure. I'll just try to be pretty short because there's a lot of things to talk about. So I would probably just say about one trend that I see very different from what was before, because as I said, I was involved in reforms implementation process and decision-making process. That's why I kind of feel the dynamics of how the decisions are made inside the country and the power of institutions. We always had an issue with institutions and institutional capacity, etc. So what is very different right now is the consolidation of power in the office of the president, which is, I think, have both like good and bad sides of this phenomenon, because there was a debate of should Zelensky be re-elected, should there be elections, should they start the political process in company, and the decision was made to postpone this process, to postpone elections. That's like partially how we can see from the public side, this internal process of power consolidation. Maybe it's pretty logical decision right now not to shake the boat from inside during this wartime and to keep the situation inside the country pretty stable, at least at this point of view. But unfortunately, many decisions are made, in a manual mode, by some bunch of people in the office of the president. And this actually a big issue in collaborating and cooperating with international partners, because the policy has become pretty unpredictable depending on, decisions of some particular people, but not the strategy, not the plan of the government, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really hard to, predict how Ukrainian policy will turn, because it's just some personal decisions. So that's I see as a big obstacle in many projects that Western partners are offering and they're trying to implement, and they have so they see a big risk in this, and it becomes an issue and an obstacle for projects implementation. But again, taking into account current situation and still a big influence of Russia in Ukraine through different channels like misinformation, disinformation, plus broad spy network inside Ukraine, et cetera, they are fueling this already existing social divisions, which I see like it's going to become a big issue in future, because now we have way more divides. Before it was just kind of language issue, right? Now it still exists, but on from different perspective, because everyone tried to switch to Ukrainian, and now those who speak Russian, they're kind of on the enemy side considered. So like my native language is Russian because I'm from Donbass, but I do so much for Ukraine, and personally I don't see an issue, but still it's like one social divide. Another, like, do you serve in the army or not? Do you volunteer or not? Did you move abroad or not? Do you still enjoy your life and post some, I don't know, pictures on Instagram where you travel or, having fun? The war. So there are so many social divides right now, and it's easy to shake this boat from inside. That most probably keeping the situation as is right thing to do. But still, this trend for power consolidation and weakening of institutions and unpredictability of policy, this is where I see the biggest issues in domestic policy right now.
Wonderful. It's a very rich composite picture that the two of you have provided of the domestic political landscape behind the battlefield story of the war. And the two, of course, constitute each other, that the military configurations have very, very significant ties to domestic politics. And the longer the war is, my prediction is just the more important domestic politics in all of these countries, including Russia, the more important domestic politics is going to become somewhat like the story of the First World War, which is never resolved on the battlefield, but is changed when the domestic politics begins to shift in various countries. Let me turn now to the question. I think that we will do this as the final question today. So I'll ask you both, Kate and Sam, in answering this question, maybe to offer a couple of final thoughts or sort of summing up thoughts, and that will take us sort of perfectly to the end of the hour. So I'll turn first to you, Sam, and then Kate will give you the last word in today's conversation and read out the question from Jordan Beale. But please feel free to, to broaden out from this question to anything that strikes you as important to conclude on. So from Jordan Beale, someone mentioned Brazilian farmers not seeing the value in supporting the Ukrainian war effort due to the abstract nature of the supposed benefits of supporting them. Turning that statement back home, what about American farmers in the middle of the country more broadly? Do you think Republican hesitancy towards supporting Ukraine is a failure of messaging from the Biden administration? And I guess the extension of the question would be, if it's not just a failure of messaging or not a failure of messaging, what might explain it? I can add a statistic to this that I think it's now roughly half of Republican voters, self-identified Republican voters, think that the United States is spending too much on Ukraine. So it's a question about that sentiment. So we'll start with you, Sam, and then we'll turn to you, Kate, and then close out the hour.
This is a really great question. So thank you, Jordan, for raising it. I think there are multiple drivers for kind of Republican hesitancy around Ukraine. I think it has to be said, given that Tucker Carlson went to interview Vladimir Putin last week, that there is an element of the Republican Party that sees something favorable in kind of Vladimir Putin's style of rule, in the kind of the policies he represents or what they believe he represents, and wish that for kind of U.S. kind of governance, or kind of wish to have a Putin style leader in the United States. I think that's fairly fair or very easy to say. And that's something that will be difficult to deal with. But I think on the other hand, there is a degree of kind of both a problem of communication by the Biden administration and kind of a strategic kind of choice that needs to be made. I think both, for here in the United States, but also in Europe too, is that, this supporting the Ukrainian war effort brings a lot of concrete benefits to the United States and to Europe. When you think about, where the money from this supplemental aid package is actually going, right? When weapons leave U.S. stocks and go to Ukraine, they need to be replenished. And so a lot of this money, I think the statistic I saw was that 60% of this goes to Americans of some shape or form, right? Be this people working in arms factories or people working in the State Department. And so there's really a financial benefit to this for Americans. So it's important for the Biden administration to make this clear, right? That there is, beyond the kind of the security normative benefits, there is a financial and economic benefit to the support. But I think the other kind of choice that needs to be made, and this is something I've seen bandied about over the past couple of months, is that the United States needs to be clear that Ukrainian victory, Ukrainian prosperity and membership in the European Union, and Russian defeat is in its own strategic interest, frankly. And so I think about the value of the transatlantic relationship and of U.S. ties with Europe, and that it's clearly in the United States' strategic interest for Europe itself to be prosperous and secure. And so if you're thinking about larger priorities here, competition with China, or kind of confronting transnational problems like climate change or pandemics, that the United States relationship with Europe is its most important relationship. And so if, because of a Russian victory in Ukraine, you can kind of spell out all kinds of knock-on effects from this, be it huge amounts of refugees going to Europe, or just kind of the additional economic stress, this would make Europe a less reliable partner for the United States in confronting these other challenges. And so I think if you're kind of really boiling this down to key U.S. interests, there's also a strategic case that needs to be made here that hasn't been made sufficiently, I think, because I keep seeing it said that Ukraine is not a key strategic interests, which can't be further from the truth.
Wonderful, and that synthesizes, sort of coming full circle, some of the points that Kate made in her opening comments about the need for practical commitments and a sort of a network of practical, concrete connections that will bind the United States to Ukraine and vice versa. That becomes a kind of long-range vision beyond the war, of course, of what this relationship can and should look like. So, Kate, let's turn to you for the last word about, either U.S. voting habits or attitudes or anything else that you'd like to develop by way of conclusion.
Yeah, I'll just add to this, in addition to practical ideas and initiatives or broader strategic picture, it is always essential to have a very well thought and well planned communication strategy, basically for anything that administration wants to implement or do, because I do understand an average American working somewhere in the Midwest in a farm is not very concerned about Ukraine or what's happening somewhere in Russia or China or something like that. So that's why a very clear communication strategy for the most high priority things should be developed. And again, from my experience, it should be very straightforward with very simple, easy to understand messages, and these messages should actually, form a chain of arguments if the administration wants to move into that direction or that direction. And without this public support, again, it's from my experience of implementation of reforms, which was in Ukraine, and sometimes we had to form a public opinion in Europe as well. So you just develop a set of arguments and you translate them into pretty simple messages, and just repeating that messages, it's like basic of public communication, should be delivered. So, and me being here for the past couple of years, I see this communication, and it's clearly a huge gap, because I also translate myself as a consumer of this information and consumer of the communication that comes from the Biden administration through accessible channels like social media and TV. So I understand what kind of information an average American gets, and it's not sufficient, and it's not simple, and it's hard to build this, global picture. So as Sam said, yes, we need to explain the economic benefits. We need to explain the strategic consequences. We need to explain why, for an average American, Ukraine is important, how it affects American economy, how it affects American security, et cetera, but in very simple way. So I definitely agree, and I feel that there is a huge gap here, and administration should focus more on delivering their messages and their strategies to average people, no matter what party affiliation they have. It's just human factor. We consume information in the same way, and that's what we should tackle as a strategist and politicians.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you so much, Sam, since we do have a kind of German frame for this conversation, this audience, and the institution that we're sort of speaking to and sort of honoring this morning. I would just say that there's a historical precedent, I think, for what the two of you are describing, and this is the U.S.-German relationship in the 1940s, which transitioned at a certain point from a relationship of fear to a relationship of opportunity. And I think when Americans look at Germany now, 2024, predominantly what they think of is opportunity, a place to travel, a place to study, a place to form business partnerships with. And I think since it is useful and I think appropriate to end this conversation on a note of optimism, I don't think that Americans have any kind of relationship of fear to Ukraine. That's not the problem, although they may fear the fallout of the war. But I think they need to be nudged toward this vision of a relationship of opportunity. And for the practical aspects of that, we may wish to go back and study the sort of 1940s and the recalibration of the U.S.-German relationship in that decade. I'm sure, Kate, to take your word, it gives us a lot of practical things to think about, which is always good. But let me thank Ilanka and Christian again, the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, for sponsoring this event. And it's such a pleasure to be in the midst of the Humboldt family again.